Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to unpack one of the most absolutely incredible geographic paradoxes on the planet. I mean, we are looking at a place that, by all accounts of logic, should be a desolate, completely unlivable wasteland. Yet, against all odds, it has completely transformed into a globally dominant billion-dollar hub. All right, let's dive right into the remarkable story of Bermuda. You know, most of us have this massive geographic misconception. When you hear the word Bermuda, your brain probably instantly jumps to a Caribbean paradise, right? You're picturing it down near Jamaica or the Bahamas, surrounded by calm, shallow, tropical seas. But the reality? Bermuda isn't in the Caribbean at all. It sits entirely alone in the vast, hostile expanse of the North Atlantic Ocean. The closest landmass is the coast of North Carolina, which is some 650 miles away. There are no neighboring islands to trade with, no protective archipelagos to hide behind. It is literally just a lone speck in the deep blue, sitting right in the bullseye of the world's most violent ocean storms. So it begs the question, doesn't it? How exactly did a solitary, cursed rock with absolutely zero natural resources become one of the wealthiest places on Earth? How in the world did its inhabitants turn a literal geographic nightmare into a massive global economic asset? Section 1. The Isle of Devils. Okay, so Bermuda exists purely because the island is actually the fossilized coral tip of a massive, extinct underwater volcano. To really wrap our heads around its origins, we have to look way back. Millions of years ago, a colossal mountain rose 15,000 feet right up from the seafloor. As that volcano went dormant and began to sink, ancient microscopic organisms started building coral reefs around the rim. Over successive ice ages, those reefs were crushed into sand and compacted into highly porous limestone. So when you walk on Bermuda today, you are literally standing on millions of years of fossilized coral resting on a sunken volcanic pedestal. Crazy, right? Because of its extreme isolation, Bermuda sat completely alone and totally devoid of human life for millions of years. It was just a blank slate. Even when humans finally started crossing the oceans, it stayed empty. In 1505, a Spanish sea captain named Juan de Bermudez spotted the island, but the Spanish wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. They fled. And it wasn't until 1609 that we see the defining moment that finally brought humanity to its shores.
Section 2. An accidental settlement.
It's kind of an ironic twist of fate that the very storms that make Bermuda so dangerous are exactly what brought its first inhabitants. Remember that Spanish sea captain from 1505? Well, the reason they fled wasn't just the treacherous hidden coral reefs that shredded their wooden ships. Those who survived the wrecks and made it near the shore reported hearing terrifying demonic shrieking echoing from the dark forest at night. They actually named it the Isle of Devils and avoided it like the plague. Now, the hilarious reality is that these terrifying demons were actually just the loud, eerie mating calls of the native cowhall bird, mixed with the grunts of wild pigs left behind by earlier shipwrecks. But hey, that little misunderstanding kept the island beautifully empty for another entire century. That is, until a massive natural disaster forced the issue. In 1609, an English ship called the Sea Venture was carrying colonists to Jamestown, Virginia. Right en route, they sailed straight into a massive hurricane. Rapidly taking on water, the ship's admirals spotted Bermuda and intentionally drove the vessel into the island's reefs to prevent it from sinking into the deep ocean. Amazingly, all 150 people survived. They spent 10 months on the island building new ships from the wreckage and native Bermuda cedar. By the time they finally sailed on, they realized this cursed wasteland was actually quite beautiful, leading the English to officially colonize it in 1612. Section 3. Engineering around impossible geography. Now, getting there is one thing, but surviving? That's a whole different ballgame. In stark terms, Bermuda is a geographic nightmare. Because the island is entirely made of that highly porous limestone we talked about earlier, it has absolutely zero natural freshwater resources. No rivers, no freshwater lakes, no deep aquifers to pump from, nothing. Any rain that falls simply filters straight through the porous rock and mixes with the salty ocean water below. You can't grow crops without water, and you certainly can't support a civilization. So the early English colonists had to engineer their way around this immediately, and their solution was so brilliantly simple that it completely defined Bermuda's architecture forever. They began carving their roofs out of local limestone in this distinct stepped terrace pattern. When it rains, those stepped terraces first slow the water down. Next, the white-painted limestone reflects the sun and naturally purifies the water. It's like a giant natural Brita filter built right into your house. Finally, every single drop is funneled into large underground cisterns. This architectural trick is so incredibly effective that even today, it's literally written into Bermuda's building codes.
Section 4. The pivot to piracy.
All right, so the water issue was solved, but they still had a massive economy problem. It's a fundamental question. The colonists quickly realized that traditional survival methods, like growing agricultural cash crops such as tobacco, were a total dead end. The island was simply too small, and the limestone soil was way too shallow to compete with massive plantations over in Virginia or the Caribbean. With no crops and absolutely no minerals to mine, how on earth do you survive?
Well, you look to the ocean. Bermuda pivoted hard. They used their incredibly strong native Bermuda cedar to build famously fast and agile ships, becoming a true maritime powerhouse. They completely dominated the regional salt trade. But most intriguingly, they turned to privateering, which, let's be honest, is essentially highly organized state-sponsored piracy. For a long time, Bermuda's economy absolutely thrived on legally intercepting enemy ships and taking their cargo, right up until the golden age of sail eventually ended.
Section 5. Monetizing global disasters. With piracy outlawed, Bermuda faced economic ruin yet again. But their next evolution is quite possibly the most mind-bending twist of this entire explainer. To understand modern Bermuda, you really have to look at this unique geopolitical loophole. Bermuda is the oldest British overseas territory, but it is almost entirely self-governing, with a parliament dating way back to 1620. The UK only steps in for military defense and foreign diplomacy. This extreme autonomy means Bermuda writes its own internal laws and, crucially, its own tax code. And guess what? They decided to charge zero corporate income tax. They realized they didn't need to raid ships anymore. They just needed to provide a highly regulated, untaxed harbor for the world's money. But they didn't just become some generic tax haven. They specialized in something they knew intimately from their very first founding shipwreck: catastrophic disaster. They became the global epicenter for something called reinsurance. It sounds a bit dry, I know, but reinsurance is simply insurance for insurance companies. Think about it. If a massive hurricane hits Florida, a regular insurance company might go completely bankrupt trying to pay 100,000 claims all at once. To prevent that collapse, they transfer that massive risk to a reinsurance company, providing a multi-billion-dollar safety net. To put that into perspective, Bermuda has a staggering global footprint. The vast majority of the world's biggest catastrophe reinsurance companies live right there in Bermuda's capital city. Because of their tax status and their proximity to incredibly expensive U.S. coastal real estate, they dominate the market. Following major recent U.S. hurricanes, Bermudian reinsurers have paid out roughly 30% of all reconstruction claims. They basically act as a giant financial shock absorber for the world's absolute worst days.
But here is where the ultimate irony kicks in. The warm waters of the Gulf Stream that give Bermuda its famously pleasant climate are the exact fuel needed for massive hurricanes. As ocean temperatures rise, natural disasters are increasing in both frequency and ferocity. Now, you'd think more disasters would bankrupt an economy built entirely on disaster claims, right? Counterintuitively, it actually makes them wealthier. As global risks increase, standard insurance companies panic and buy more reinsurance. Bermuda employs armies of climate scientists and data analysts to build these incredibly complex mathematical models. They price the risk perfectly, meaning they are making highly calculated, highly profitable bets on the global climate.
Section 6. The price of paradise. So what does this trillion-dollar macroeconomic maneuvering actually mean for the everyday people living on the island? Well, because of the massive influx of reinsurance capital, Bermuda boasts one of the highest gross domestic products per capita on the entire planet, routinely hovering well over $100,000 per person. On paper, the wealth here is absolutely incredible, resulting in highly resilient, top-tier infrastructure that barely blinks when a Category 4 hurricane rolls through. But we have to juxtapose that extreme wealth with physical reality. Despite its massive footprint on the global economy, Bermuda is astonishingly small. The entire island is only about 21 square miles. That is literally smaller than the island of Manhattan. And living on this tiny strip of limestone is a population of roughly 64,000 people. It's basically the population size of a minor suburb, yet they're wielding the economic power of an empire. However, there is a pretty painful catch for the locals. Because it's an isolated rock with zero natural resources and no major agriculture, absolutely everything has to be imported by ship or plane. Every single piece of lumber, every car, every drop of fuel, and nearly every piece of food at the grocery store. Combine those extreme supply chain costs with billionaire executives driving up local real estate, and Bermuda consistently ranks as having the highest cost of living in the entire world. Earning $100,000 a year here, that barely makes you middle class. Bermuda is truly the ultimate geographic paradox. Through sheer human ingenuity, brilliant architectural adaptation, and a pretty cutthroat pivot into high finance, they somehow turned a cursed, isolated rock into a global economic powerhouse. But it leaves us with this final, really provocative thought. Can a territory whose entire wealth is built on mathematically predicting catastrophic disasters actually survive if the global climate becomes entirely unpredictable? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep your curiosity sharp.